Hello, students. Let's cover chapter 1 in lifespan psychology. So, a bunch of these slides are things that if you're in an in-person class, are things we go over in the first day, syllabus, stuff like that, textbook. So, I'm going to skip over these really quickly because you should have already seen them and jump into the actual content of the chapter. So, lifespan development is about development over the entire lifespan. So, this is change over time. So, development is really just a word for change. We oftentimes think of development as just growing, but it also is related to shrinking capacities as well. You can see in this, if it picks up my mouse over here, you can see these people are shrinking towards the end of their life. That is one common thing that happens to people, and it is also development. It is change over time, even though we don't usually think of the word development as something shrinking. But let's talk about that. So the lifespan development is important and useful for you to study because it is related to your entire life. So you're going to be working with people, interacting with people all throughout your life that are developing and at different points in their development. So development is lifelong. Research used to focus a lot on early childhood and adolescence. You'd find libraries full of the research papers and books written about that time of life. But today we know there's a significant amount of development or change over time, growth and decline. So not just decline, but also growth all the way throughout adulthood. So learning about adult development is really useful, especially for college students who are in different stages of adulthood to know what to expect and things like that. Development's also multidimensional, not exactly this type of multidimensional. This just gives me an excuse to put some fun pictures on the slides. Really, this is the type of multidimensional that I'm talking about. So for any individual, so this circle here is an individual, could be a child, could be an adolescent, could be an adult, and they're made of different components. So their own cognition, their own personality, their own behavior, the demands on their time, their health. Do they have a chronic health condition or not? So these are all dimensions of an individual. And all of those might be able to change at some degree at any given point of life. So development's also multi-directional. I mentioned a little earlier that the shrinking of a person is also development. So just like a tree, we see it changing over the seasons. People or aspects, components of people grow and shrink over time. So for an example, the capacity to learn language is really, really large in early childhood, but that decreases after early childhood. It's harder to learn a new language when you're in, say, high school or later on in adulthood, which is why dual immersion programs are so good because they really immerse a student, a young student whose brain is really primed for learning language. It's still possible to learn languages later on in life, especially if you already know more than one language. If you already know more than one language, it's really easy. So that's a component that can shrink more for a person who already does know more than one language. And this is also related to plasticity. Plasticity means capacity for change. So when you're thinking of something in the brain or development being plastic, it's moldable, it's movable. So like clay, or like a soft rubber, Play-Doh, something like that. So older adults can still learn to master new skills. Development is also, so with that being said, with plasticity, almost everything can change to some degree at every point in the lifespan. Not everything, but a lot of things. Some things can change more, some things can change less, some things might not change at all, but almost everything can change to some degree. Development's also multidisciplinary. So pause the video really quickly, think about other disciplines who might care about human development. Some are sociology, anthropology, medicine, neuroscience, biology. All of these fields do look at human development. So this is a researcher who also researches heroism, just like me, Stephanie Preston, and she looks at the genetics. She looks at rats, mice, other mammals to see, are they going to act pro-socially? Will they even take risks and risk their own food or well-being for children that aren't their own litter of children? So it's really interesting research that's connected to mine, but that's not the training I have. So I can work with people who are doctors, anthropologists, neuroscientists, so that we can learn more things altogether. Another big thing in development is contextual. So context basically means setting. So there's a lot of settings that influence and a lot of systems that influence our life and our development. So the family, schools, peer groups, if you have a church, your own city, the neighborhood, all of these are different settings that influence us in certain ways. So this model here that's been up for a little bit, this individual child has all those components that are part of them. And this child has maybe a parent, maybe their parent is married. So how is their parents' marriage? How does that affect them? The child's social network, their own peers, the community around them, the society and culture at large. These are all impacting these kids. So history, culture, and place and time are also contexts. There's probably differences of kids who went through high school during COVID versus not, right? So any student who went through high school during COVID is probably having a different experience than a student who didn't go through high school during COVID. That is a context. Their development was different because of that. So another way to look at this is this modern theory of lifespan development. And so you'll see both that learner's developmental contextual model a lot of times through the class, but you'll also see Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory or model. And these are essentially the same, basically the same basic theory that systems can affect people and people can affect those systems. This is just described in different ways. So the mesosystem, this one here, or sorry, microsystem, we'll start there, is those things that we interact with a lot. So family, school, peers, roommates, the people that we are impacting and affecting on a day-to-day basis or a weekly basis. This exosystem is one step removed. So we probably see our neighbors every once in a while. The mass media has some influence on us. The local politics do as well. Social services might dictate what kind of health services are available to us in our microsystem. But this exosystem we have a little bit less control over, even though they're still influencing us. And then this biggest one, macrosystem, are the attitudes and ideologies of a culture. So if you're in a multicultural household, you might have multiple cultures affecting you through your macrosystem. And so mostly we have the most impact and most direct influence from this microsystem. The mesosystem is basically connections between all these systems. So while maybe for a child, a parent's workplace would be their exosystem, it's still affecting their microsystem. Their parent might come home extra tired or extra stressed or extra happy or something like that. And so that is the mesosystem interacting, the parent's interaction with that system. So this is the same model here on the left. It's just a couple other examples. So feel free to read over those to get a good sense of what these systems are. If you're confused by this at this point, totally fine. We are going to learn a lot about these systems theories throughout the course. All right, development is also looking at not just growth, but maintenance of capacities that we currently have, as well as any regulation of any loss that we experience. So humans do experience loss, say loss of vision in this image here. So that is one thing that developmental psychologists look at as well, is how can we maintain those capacities? How can we build capacities at any time in life? If there is something we're expecting to decrease, how can we mitigate that? So development is the individual changing over the lifespan due to their biology, their culture, the context they're in. So really development is all the things. And so it's a very broad field. It does influence, or the study of it really does cover the entire lifespan. So a couple main focuses in developmental research that we'll find, and you'll see examples of throughout the textbook and examples in our classes, are health and well-being. So maybe take some time to think about some research questions that developmental psychologists might ask about health and well-being. Also, parenting is a big focus of developmental research. What parenting styles are good? How is divorce affecting children? Those kinds of things. Education is another big area of developmental research, and we'll work with other disciplines like education professionals to figure out what kinds of education work best. What's the best way to teach sharing? What's the best way to teach math? How can we boost students' self-efficacy? These kinds of things. There's also a big focus, especially more recently in, let's say, the last 15 years or so, on sociocultural context and diversity. So in the past, there was a lot more focus on very white middle class male samples. So very small, very not very diverse, not a lot of sociocultural context. But especially in the last 20, 15 years, we've been doing a better job of putting more funding towards researching all people around the world from different places. So with that, let's define a couple terms that'll come up many times in the course. So culture, this is the behavior, the patterns, the beliefs, and the products that a group passes on through generations. So those products can be anything from like music or stories to literal physical products you could buy. So that is culture. Ethnicity is kind of a bigger bubble. It includes cultural heritage, but it also includes things like nationality, race, religion, language. So a couple examples here are European American or Arab American. So it's a little distinct from culture. SES, as I'll usually refer to it, is socioeconomic status. So that is a person's position in society based on both their occupation, education, economic status. So you might have heard terms like working class, working poor, poverty, 1%. These are kind of getting towards socioeconomic status, but they're not exactly the same thing. As an example, I have two friends that one has been a friend since high school. Right after high school, they got into welding. They went through a bunch of training programs, and they've now been welding for many years, and they are making quite a lot of money doing it. So, as opposed to another friend that I have that recently completed their training to be a family doctor, a family physician. So the family doctor is actually making a little bit less money. Well, actually quite a bit less now in the last few years than my friend who's a welder. So the welder is making more money, but the prestige and the position of the doctor kind of puts them at a different socioeconomic status. So just money-wise, the welder is making more money, but the doctor has a little bit more prestige and with the job from people's assumptions. So SES is a kind of complicated topic to give you an idea of all the things that go into it. All right, gender is another thing that will come up quite a few times in the book and in the class. We'll have a whole section on gender identity development. So gender is the socially constructed roles, behaviors, and activities, and any kind of attributes that any given culture associates with any particular biological sex or their apparent biological sex. So gender identity itself is a person's sense of being male, female, agender, gender fluid, gender queer, transgender, all the different varieties of gender. The gender identity is how you feel that you are. And then gender expression is simply how they present. Do they conform to roles that other people expect? That kind of thing. So hopefully you can see from these specific variables we've just mentioned how all of these can be combined and studied. So how does gender expression affect or interact with socioeconomic status? How is that different in early childhood versus adolescence versus late adulthood? So all of these are variables that developmental psychologists will look at. And we'll do also studies that focus on things like social policies. What laws or policies or programs can we implement to help? There's a lot of things that we can do to reduce poverty and homelessness, make better educational interventions. So oftentimes developmental psychologists are evaluating programs, they're pilot testing new programs, they're conducting research to see, well, what works. So here's a slide with just a picture from your textbook as a couple examples of some topics. Another big area of developmental research more recently has been technology. So technology use has increased all over the lifespan. So we can ask questions about, well, how does technology or how does the media interact with culture? Should I let my 7-year-old play Minecraft? So these are questions that you can ask yourself, or a developmental psychologist might ask. Is technology beneficial in education? Is it harming education? Is it harming attention spans? These are questions developmental psychologists will look into. So another big area, especially with my courses, is human thriving. So a lot of developmental research focuses on what goes right with people, how to help people thrive, how to help them be happy and healthy and fulfilled throughout their lifespan. So that is a big focus of my classes, as well as developmental psychology overall. All right, so as we go through this class, you'll see different sections of your book kind of splitting off into a couple different topics: biological processes, cognitive processes, and socio-emotional processes. So, with all of these processes, they are all overlapping. Even though some sections of your book might focus on one of them or the other, they are overlapping all the time. So, biological processes include anything from our genes that we've inherited, our hormones, the nutrition that we're taking in, motor skills. All of these are really focused around biological processes. And cognitive processes are the thinking that we do. How do we think? How do we solve problems? What do we mean by intelligence? What is perception? And also, how do memories work? So these are things that have more of a cognitive focus. Then socio-emotional processes are those things like emotions, emotional development. So when does anger or empathy appear? How does it change over time? What about personality? What about relationships, which is really simply just how a person relates to others? And then the social context. So while your book will often kind of separate and discuss and kind of focus in on one thing, I do want you to remember all of these are happening at the same time. The biology is affecting the cognition is affecting social emotional processes, and they're all affecting one another. So one is not more than another, they're all overlapping and happening at the same time. So we'll see a lot of examples of that through the lifespan. All right, so these are the periods of development. So they'll be mentioned quite a few times, so be good to kind of memorize these phases of life. So the prenatal period, that's before birth. So anytime from conception to birth, that is the prenatal period. Infancy is birth to about 1.5 to 2 years. And then early childhood is about 3 to 5 years. Middle childhoods, about 6 to 11 or 12 years. It depends on the researcher you ask about when adolescence starts. So adolescence starts, depending on who you ask, anywhere from 10 to age 13, and then ends anywhere from, say, 18 to early 20s. So then early adulthood is basically the 20s to the 30s. You might see some researchers stretch that out to 35 as well. So you might see a researcher say early adulthood includes anything from even 18 to 35. Then middle adulthood is 40s through 50s, even up to 60s. And then late adulthood is basically after 60 or 65. So as you can see, there's a lot more or a lot smaller components in this early period of life. A lot more focus in research generally has been done on these time periods, and a lot less in this middle adulthood and late adulthood phase. So there's a lot more than there used to be. There's a bigger focus on adulthood now in developmental research, but there still is a lot more information that we know about these first, say, five periods. So there's other periods that are possible to discuss. One is emerging adulthood. This would fit in somewhere between about 18 to 25. And this is a time of life that's really characterized by identity exploration, feeling still a little unstable, still being pretty focused on the self, and feeling in between. Like you're not quite an adult, but you're not an adolescent. So a lot of you in this class might be in that time of life, well, within those ages. So you can see in this picture here, a person with their PhD still lives with their parents, which honestly, for the cost of PhD programs, isn't a bad idea, but it would definitely contribute to this person feeling in between, like they're not quite an adult and they're not an adolescent, even though they're making pretty adult decisions getting that degree. So that's something that we see in Western countries like the US, Australia, a lot of European countries, but we don't see it everywhere. And so we'll talk about maybe some of the reasons that might be. So that is why it is not included in this general periods of development. Some researchers say we should ignore emerging adulthood and just use early adulthood and adolescence since we don't see this everywhere in the world. But if you're only studying places where this is happening, if that's your focus, well, then knowing that's a phenomena that might be happening to your participants or the people around that you're studying, that could be useful. All right, so as we go through this class, we'll talk about a variety of developmental issues. So things like nature versus nurture, stability versus change, continuity versus discontinuity. Is early life more important than later life experiences? So this is going to be something that we really focus on all throughout the class. And I have a funny little thing I saw that reminds me of this. So here it's really funny that do babies grow on their own or do we need to interact with them? That really gets at nature and nurture. And obviously this is for a comment about a video game, not real life. Obviously we do need to interact with babies. There is definitely nature and nurture together, but we'll go over and talk about these. So nature is basically the idea of things being dependent on biology versus nurture is dependent on the environment, depending on your training or parenting or education, these kinds of things. Stability is the idea that personality or your temperament would be stable throughout your whole life, that you would meet someone at 20 and you'd expect them to be pretty similar at 27. Versus change is how much does the personality or temperament change, or can it change? So you might have your own assumptions about that right now. Continuity versus discontinuity. This is continuity is there kind of a constant slow growth, or discontinuity is are there little jumps in time? So do you have a sudden new ability or sudden new capacities to do things? And so we'll show some examples of all of these. For each of these, nature, nurture, stability, change, continuity, discontinuity, early versus later, the final answer is basically it depends. It depends what's more important. Some things nature is going to be more important, some things nurture is going to be more important, but usually it's some combination of each. So we'll go along throughout the class and see some really good examples of all of those. Right. Here's another example of continuity and discontinuity. Continuous growth is kind of similar to, say, a tree. You see it growing some leaves, it's a little bigger, it still looks very tree-like, versus discontinuity. You've got this larva becoming a ladybug. It has an egg, larva stage, it's got this little cocoon thing, and then becomes a ladybug. These are very distinct, sudden kind of changes. So this is continuity, this is more discontinuity. So both exist, but again, most human development tends to be continuous, but it's not always. So there are aspects of discontinuity in human development that we will talk about. Another good visual model to think about when you're thinking about development and change over time is this developmental cascades model. So this is a good model to think of how people change over time. You can think of it as this Plinko board. If you've ever seen this game played, you're trying to get a good score. And so you drop a ball, it bounces off these pegs. It might bounce all the way to over here, or it might bounce all the way to over here. So the reason this is called developmental cascades is because we might have a variety of things in life that kind of push us to, let's say this is negative outcomes, and this over here on the right is positive outcomes. So you might start with your little water droplet right here, right in the middle between negative and positive. Then maybe something happens, some risk factors. Maybe you lose a parent or you have a traumatic car accident or something like that. Whatever it might be, some of your outcomes might be a little more negative looking. But then you have something positive. So this drop of water might move all the way over here. Some protective factors. So with that, thinking about this waterfall flowing throughout the entire lifespan, our capacities have a range of where they could end up. Both with nature and nurture, we have a wide variety of places we could fall on this developmental cascade. Another thing that we should talk about with developmental psychology is theories. So a lot of people use the term theory incorrectly. You might have heard someone during an argument or something be really dismissive of a point someone's making by saying, oh, that's just a theory. So that's not actually how scientists use the term theory. So Just to be clear, before we dive into some modern developmental theories, well, historical and modern developmental theories, let's be clear about what a theory is. So this could be really useful for any of your science classes. So rather than some general idea or some proposed explanation, a theory is actually a really broad idea or a whole bunch of sets of ideas all mixed together that can explain and predict observations. So to have a theory, first you've got a lot of data, a lot of evidence, and this is a theory is the way that you are describing and predicting, explaining all of that evidence all round up together. That's why when we say something like the theory of gravity, it's not that we think that gravity might suddenly not exist. It's the way that we describe all of our explanations from all of the different areas that study this, that all of that together is the theory of gravity. An example in psychology, especially developmental psychology, is the theory of attachment. How do attachments work, like secure attachments or insecure attachments? How are those relevant? How can we take the observations we have around attachment styles and explain and then predict people's behaviors with those attachment styles? So that is how we use theory. Another important key piece of a theory is that we try to make it falsifiable. And so falsifiable basically means we have to state it or describe the theory, describe this evidence in a way that we could potentially prove the theory false, so that it can be testable to be able to prove it false. So let's give some examples of this, of falsification, to make this a little more clear. Let's use a older theory from back many generations ago. So this is the theory of spontaneous generation. So Aristotle and many people in the day believed that matter simply became other matter, that it generated other matter. And that was based on their observations. Remember, a theory is this broad idea or set of ideas. Spontaneous generation was the way that they explained their observations. And so they saw things like dead wood becoming mushrooms. So it looked like the dead wood spawned the mushrooms. The matter of the dead wood became mushrooms instead. They saw grain on ships disappearing, and suddenly mice appeared. So the grain maybe became mice. So it was spontaneous generation was their explanation for the data and the observations that they had. Obviously, we can look at that now with further science and observation and say, well, that doesn't really make sense with how these things work. But they didn't have all those tools at the time. So let's talk about how this theory was falsified. So that spontaneous generation was the broad idea or set of ideas together that explained these observations. It explained what they could observe with their eyes. So the falsification for this theory took quite a long time. So it was first falsified or proved false by Francisco Redi in 1668. Essentially, he found that maggots did not spontaneously generate from all rotting meat. And what he did was that, my face might be covering up some of these images here, but there's a glass jar that's open to the air with some meat in it, and a glass jar that's closed to the air with meat in it. He put both of those out in the same environment, and lo and behold, we found that the glass jar that was open to the air developed maggots. The one that was closed to the air did not. And so, poof, everybody abandoned spontaneous generation. It was never a thing again. People didn't ever think of it. No, that's not the case. It took quite a while because, as well as showing that that one theory, spontaneous generation, didn't explain everything it should, you have to have a new theory to explain all of the new observations that you're making. So it actually took quite a while. One of the problems here was that when another researcher might try this study, maybe they don't have as good of control over the variables, control over the environment. Maybe the jar is not sealed well enough. So it actually took until 1859 and Louis Pasteur, Pasteur, so he was the same person with that, took a very similar experiment. Rather than chunks of meat to be a little more controlled, he boiled some meat broth and put it in a sealed flask or a swan-necked flask. So, and was able to see that, hey, in these flasks, that weird film, they didn't know what it was called yet, that weird film didn't generate. So, but again, other people had to replicate this, and the problem is, with what we know as bacteria now, It can survive, well, some kinds can survive being boiled. That's why Yellowstone has so many amazing colors, is because there are bacteria living in the different heat levels within geysers. So in some cases, people didn't have all the control over their variables. They didn't have as good of methods yet. And so when they tried to falsify, they tried to do another experiment to show that spontaneous generation didn't explain it. It didn't work out the way that they were thinking. So it took those 200 years about to come up with a new theory of what was happening here. It takes a while to throw away that new theory completely. Maybe there's some other thing happening that's outside of spontaneous generation. Maybe there's a second theory to explain, or there's some adjustments we can make to it. But we did eventually falsify or prove spontaneous generation to be false because it was described or discussed in a way that we could test it to make sure it was false. An example of that with something like the theory of gravity, our current understanding is at a specific point. But if we discover maybe other particles or waves or other aspects that are affecting gravity, maybe we can then alter our theory of gravity, include those into it. Or it might require us to completely rethink how we describe the theory of how gravity is working. So that is what scientists do. So that's how we actually use theories. It's really broad overall explanations of things rather than just one little prediction. So a good video to watch on this is here. We're not going to watch this whole thing to 15 minutes, but we'll watch a little bit of it, and hopefully I can capture the audio well enough as we do this.
Flat Earth and other debates about otherwise accepted scientific fact bring out a much larger problem. Our understanding of science is terrible. And I'm not complaining that people don't remember the laws of thermodynamics or that I still don't understand how magnets work.
Water, fire, air, and dirt. And magnets, how do they work?
I'm talking about the philosophy of science. So, what is the philosophy of science? It's philosophy, obviously, that asks questions like how do we distinguish science from non science? And with that, how should we weigh evidence when testing a hypothesis? What kind of evidence is acceptable? Basically, how do we know if we know shit? You might remember learning the scientific method, and that's part of it, but it barely scratches the surface. There are a lot of philosophies of science, and I'm not here to tell you what the right model is. It's important to understand that all of these frameworks have strengths and weaknesses. And to us, it's our general ignorance of how science works that allows for the abuse of scientific language we see in things like flat Earth. So to get a better understanding of how flat earthers can use the language of science and evidence to persuade people, let's go back in time. In the early 1900s, there was a scientific doctrine posed by a group known as logical positivists called verificationism. This model essentially posits that science is something that can be verified. If it can't be verified, it ain't science. So philosophical statements like the meaning of life is be excellent to each other, not science because, how would you verify that? Let's start with a very simple example. If I were to say this swan is white, you could say, hey, it looks white to me. I could pass it around and you could also verify it is white. So awesome. We're using our senses in a way that can be replicated by others. So it's been verified. And as such, this swan is white could be considered a meaningful scientific statement. In this model, if you want to verify that the Earth is round or flat, one way would be to go up in space and look at it.
How do you know it's a globe? Well, it's because you saw this. It's not like you've been up there in your Jetsons car. Nobody's got a spaceship.
And in this way, flat earthers seem to at least allude to this basic idea of verification. But how do you verify a statement like all swans are white, which Europeans considered to be the case before the 1600s? Let's say you and others have encountered thousands of swans and every single one was white. Is this evidence enough? Well, not quite for the verificationist, and this was a huge problem for them. When it came to universal statements like all swans are white, all hipsters drink PBR, all mass exerts gravitational pull, you can never truly verify that. What if there's a theoretical hipster out there who shuns PBR in favor of Heineken?
Heineken, yes, blue ribbon.
Or a black swan, which, by the way, was discovered by Europeans in Australia in the 1690s. Now, flat earthers may latch on.
All right, so before we get some more of this example, let's go back to what we were just talking about on those slides. So with this, we were talking about falsifying things. So this video is talking about verification, right? So that is what we had before we got to falsification. So it's going to move forward. So hopefully you can see how that verifying is still something that we do use in science. We do both verify and falsify still. The kind of gold standard is to do falsification to make sure we are trying to prove our theories wrong, that we're trying to poke holes in it kind of thing. So it'll give a couple more examples of how we transition from verifying to falsification. But still, even now in all sciences, verification, you might have heard of things like replication. Oftentimes, replication is another example of verifying. It's verifying a previous finding. Maybe a previous finding looks like it falsified a theory, so we verify, we try it again. And that's what we see here from this going from Francisco already all the way to Pasteur, of both falsifying and verifying throughout in this process of science.
Does logic and say, well, we haven't verified the Earth is round with our eyes. But if we try to apply this as a doctrine for science that all individuals have to see things with our eyes, it'd be pretty limiting.
If there's an event like I'll just use Boston bombing again, I'm not going to believe any of those events are real unless myself I get my leg blown off.
But as far as our all swans are white problem, this was a pretty big crisis for verificationism, until a philosopher named Karl Popper proposed a now famous solution. Rather than focusing on verification, scientists should rather focus on falsification. For Popper, good science is coming up with a hypothesis and then trying really hard to prove it wrong. If you can't, you can be confident in your hypothesis. Say that all swans are white, but that doesn't mean it won't get proven wrong when, say, we discover a black swan or two in ensuing decades.
So this is what we do in science. We've moved from that verification to focusing on falsification, and you see that happening in this specific example of falsifying spontaneous generation. So again, this goes back to a theory is that big, broad explanation of things. So in this, they're giving smaller examples like all swans are white. But again, we're talking overall about theories, the big, broad explanations of how things work. And still, for those theories, we're trying to falsify. We're trying to do studies that show that it doesn't work in the scenario that it's supposed to work in, that in this way or in this group, it's not exactly the same. And so that's the idea. If we're trying to poke holes in it and we have a good explanation, then even when we try, it'll still hold up. And so that's how we know we have a good, strong theory, like the theory of gravity. In, say, middle or high school, you may have heard that above theory is law. Scientists don't actually use that term because we know that when we have more data, when we have better measures, we might have a better way to explain how gravity works than we currently do. So we don't call it a law. That's why we still do call it a theory, because we still are open to it changing and modifying as we learn more and can make that theory stronger. So just a couple more minutes of this video.
If a statement could not theoretically be falsified, it ain't science. So the meaning of life is to be excellent to each other is still not science. So if I thought the Earth was flat, I might design several experiments which could prove it wasn't flat. And if my hypothesis that the Earth isn't flat is correct, then it's probably time to abandon flat Earth. Importantly, proving that the Earth is not flat does not prove that it is round, nor does proving that the Earth is not round prove that it is flat. What if it's, say, a donut balanced on a giant turtle? Now, we're going to talk a lot about Popper here, but
So that is another key thing here. Just because you falsify one aspect of a theory doesn't mean that the theory cannot possibly be altered to better explain. So like this example, it's kind of silly, but I think of the turtle from Avatar: The Last Airbender, when he talks about the donut on the back of a turtle. But essentially, it could be explained another way. Maybe there's a better way to explain this theory. Maybe we can adjust. So the key of science is how much should we adjust it versus when do we abandon a current theory in favor of a new, better explanation? And that's kind of a hard part with theory that we actually deal with in science. So going back to this, the theory is that broad idea or set of ideas. It combines all the observations about something. We have a lot of data already. So this is actually a modern developmental theory. This is called this is the zone of proximal development. It's a sociocultural learning theory, so Vygotsky's sociocultural learning theory. And the whole theory as a whole combines ideas about learning through observation, through practice, through mentoring, and emphasizes the culture a person is in. But one key piece is this zone of proximal development. So from that overarching theory, that big broad explanation, we can build hypotheses. So hypotheses are a specific testable idea that comes from that theory. And as we try to test those and falsify this theory more and more ways, the theory can either be stronger, or we can see that it doesn't actually quite explain things super well. So with this theory of the zone of proximal development, Vygotsky's sociocultural learning theory, I might make a specific hypothesis. If the overall theory says that people can learn from other people, from being mentored, then I might hypothesize that a 3-year-old can learn basic math with help. And that is one prediction that you'd make based off of Vygotsky's theory. So I could test that, right? I could go and do an experiment where I take a room of 3-year-olds, half of them, I just give them math problems and let them try to do it on their own. And the other half, I give them tutors. I have the tutors try and teach them to see if they can learn that basic math with help. And that would suggest that maybe in this case, if it comes out that they are learning math, then that might suggest that the theory is a little stronger. It is making good predictions and explanations. But if it turns out that I can't teach those young people, that is kind of a falsification against that theory and suggests, well, maybe it's not the best explanation. So that's how we actually use theories and pull hypotheses from them. So let's get that out of the way. Now we have a lot better understanding of theory, and we can talk about some of the older theories in developmental psychology. So Freud was a father of psychoanalytic theory. There are others who came after as well. The main idea behind this theory is that we have a bunch of unconscious drives and motives that drive us to do things. So for Freud, a lot of these were sexual impulses that were completely unconscious, like we had no awareness of them and led us to do different behaviors or make different choices. So other psychoanalytic theorists that we'll even talk about throughout this course are Erikson. Erikson talked about them not as psychosexual stages, but talked about life developing through psychosocial stages, that our interactions with other people gave us unconscious drives that led us to try and get through different crises through life. So things like trust versus mistrust earlier on in life, in adolescence, identity versus being confused about your roles in the world, to in later adulthood, have you lived a life of integrity or are you despairing because you did not? So these are looking at social, unconscious social motivations for behaviors. So here's another diagram of that, of the different age ranges of these different crises for Erikson. So again, these psychosocial theories are trying to take observations that the researchers made and make predictions, make explanations under a big name of this psychosocial theory. Another form of theory are cognitive theories. These often focus on conscious thoughts, the thought processes, how memory works. So some that you'll see throughout the book are Piaget's cognitive developmental theory, so Vygotsky's sociocultural theory we just mentioned a few minutes ago, and emotion or information processing theory. These are examples of some types of cognitive theories that are about what is going on within your brain. How is it processing information? So here's some of Piaget's stages. So we've got sensory motor early on in life, pre-operational in still early childhood. Then as we get towards adolescence, concrete operational. And then for Piaget specifically, after you get to be about 12 years old, your brain has kind of figured out how to do its processing and you don't have any more change after that. Not actually the case. We'll talk a lot about that in this lifespan development class, but that is not actually the case. We do have a lot of change in our cognition throughout the lifespan. Additionally, with these observations, they were a good place to start, but we see a lot of these happen earlier than Piaget thought. Better methods and better ways to test have let us see a lot of these happen earlier on. So Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, the broad thing is that people construct their knowledge and understanding. So again, this is a cognitive theory. What is going on within your brain? How are you putting things together? Vygotsky's described this as a sociocultural theory, basically the idea that any person is influenced by the cultures around them, and that culture gives them or mentors them in the tools of the culture. So a good example of a tool is language. So whatever culture you're in, you will learn the language or languages that are relevant to that culture. You might learn math if that's relevant. You might learn how to hunt. You might learn how to use a bus system, right? Whatever is important to the culture and community around you is going to be delivered to you. And you'll be able to start from what you can do without any help. And this zone of proximal development are those stretch things. So when you have a mentor, when you have someone giving you direct instruction, you're stretching, you're making advancements, but there's still things that you can't do. If you think of this in the sense of learning a new skill, let's say skateboarding, you might be able to balance on a skateboard, but you might not be able to do any tricks. You might not be able to do a kickflip, for example. But with help, maybe you can. Maybe you can learn that within a day, right? But you're still not going to be going to the X Games and or the Olympics and trying to skate in that kind of setting. So, but with this, you could get to that point, right? If you kept getting training, you kept getting mentorship, you kept working on it or being an apprentice for something, that circle of what you can do expands and expands and expands. So. It's a good positive way to think about learning and developing skills. A lot of education research still uses this sociocultural theory. Other cognitive theories, like the information processing theory, kind of look at humans as computers and try to understand how are we using different components of our brain specifically to do different processes. Another area of psychological theories are behavioral theories. So behaviorism really looks at behaviors. So things like raising your hand, things like are you actually did you sneeze? Did you share with someone? So actual behaviors that you can observe. And so some big pieces of this are reinforcement or punishment. So reinforcement is anything that increases a behavior over time. Punishment is anything that decreases a behavior over time. So it's not necessarily a rewarding thing for everybody, right? So a spicy food might be very reinforcing for a lot of people. For some people, it might have a punishing effect, right? And it might make you less likely to do that thing. So let's say in your fourth grade class, your teacher gives you a candy every time that you get 90% on a test. The thing is, this teacher has really spicy candies. So that's the type of candy they like. So that's what they give out. So as you might have one person who they get that 90%, they get that spicy candy and they're like, this is great. I really want more of this spicy candy. I'm going to do really well on the next test. Then you have another student who does really well on the test. They get that spicy candy and they say, oh, I really don't like this. I am maybe not going to try as hard on the test next time. It's now had a punishing effect for one student and a reinforcing effect for another. So that's what reinforcements and punishments actually are. And we look at the behaviors. Did they actually do well the next time? So this is a good video. If you want to go to the slides, you can watch it. It's a rat that was trained. I don't remember offhand if this one was the rat I trained or the rat my wife trained. If I click on it, I'll be able to tell. That's the rat I trained. So this was Crystal the rat, and it is a rat that I trained to do some parkour type of tricks through behavioral learning. So behaviorists also started to put into their theories social and cognitive pieces. So the idea here is that, yep, there's behaviors, but your behaviors can affect your cognition and environmental factors can affect them as well. So this is a loop. The environment can affect behavior, which can then affect your cognitive factors, or this can affect this. All of them can affect one another. So a good example of this and social cognitive theory is the Bobo doll experiment. So you take a bunch of kids, you put them in a room with this Bobo doll, they can play with it. If you give half of them an example of an adult punching it, kicking it, then you'll see more kids are going to punch and kick that Bobo doll. They have learned from this social cognitive process and observational learning. So more recently, the main theories in developmental psychology are these ethological and ecological systems theories. So I usually just refer to them as systems theories. So ethological is that behavior is influenced by biology, evolution, and sensitive periods in life. So one example of that is that we have evolved, it seems, the capacity to learn language really easily when we're fairly young. So if you learn more than one language when you're very young, it makes it easier later on, but that's a sensitive period for learning language. It's a lot harder for an adult than, say, a 5-year-old to learn a new language. So if you're immigrating to a new country when you are an adult and you have a child with you, that child's probably going to learn the new language a lot quicker than you as the adult will. So again, unless you already have a couple languages under your belt, then it'll be a lot easier for you. So ecological focuses on studying the change and specifically around with the environment. So this is looking at systems around people, how they influence a person, how the person influences them. So one of the theories that we've shown already is Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems model. So here we have the systems directly around us, the people and the things we're interacting with on a daily, weekly basis. So the microsystem, we've got your family, if you have a church, the health services that you're using regularly, your peers, maybe roommates, the school, and these are all having a very direct, immediate impact on you, and you can usually have a pretty immediate impact on them. Outside of that microsystem, we have the exosystem, which is like the people that you interact with every once in a while. Maybe the mass media has some impact on you. Maybe the local politics are relevant. Here under my face, it says social services. So depending on what social services are available, it might impact your peers and your school and your family. Do you have access to healthy foods, for example? That will impact your microsystem. And so those connections between exosystem and microsystem are described as the mesosystem, just a fancy name for that. And then the macro system is the biggest one. It's the broader economic, social, and political climate. So the ideologies or the culture that you're embedded in. And so you can have an effect on these ideologies and attitudes of the culture, but it's usually indirectly through these other systems, right? And in this diagram here, it's just got another couple examples to make it clear what these different systems are. So that is a systems theory. As we change over time, these aspects influence us, we influence them at the same time. Another way to look at this is learner's developmental systems theory. And I really like this one a little bit more, even though the basic idea behind them is very similar. I like this one a lot because it emphasizes this bidirectional interaction. It really has a focus on you influencing others, others influencing you back, and that system. You can have a positive impact on them, they might have a positive impact back on you, or alternatively, a negative impact. Maybe you can have a positive upward spiral or a negative downward spiral. So a big key with these systems theories is realizing that development is relatively plastic. A lot of things can change to some degree. It also means there's a lot to look at, right? You could look at how a culture is impacting a school network and impacting a child's grades. That's one study you could do. And so if you've got to have a lot of researchers doing this, you've got to have maybe an education researcher working with you. You might want to look at the biology of an individual, the biology of their parents. Maybe you want a biologist to do that, right? So we can work with other people. And it does emphasize that these contexts, that these different settings are really very important for our human development. So we have moved from, I'll just scroll back really quickly, from things like this original psychoanalytic theory at the origins, and psychoanalytic theory isn't completely gone. There's still aspects of it that are still used, even though it's not in the same form that Freud used. Like we mentioned, Erickson we'll talk about in the future. Cognitive, sociocultural, behavioral, all of this is really wrapped up into current developmental theories like the bioecological systems model or the other systems theory of learners' developmental systems theory. So with this, it is showing both the big picture and trying to focus in with the systems theory. That being said, as we're going through the book, it does take different approaches. Like it might talk about one study specifically from a behaviorist standpoint. It might talk about another specifically from a psychoanalytic standpoint. So relying on just one theory is not necessarily the best. Seeing a lot of them and how they've been used throughout the history of psychology is one thing that we'll get in this class as well. And the book demonstrates the research that happens from a lot of researchers. They have different assumptions, they come from different backgrounds. So most current research in development does use this bioecological systems theories and these developmental systems theories. Another thing to focus on in this developmental psych chapter is the research methods that we use. So you might have seen some of these if you took a general psychology course, but let's talk about some of the specific ones that are really relevant to developmental psychology, but give a brief description of a bunch of others. So one way we do research is observation. Observation can be as simple as just observing someone in a natural setting. So if you want to learn about children sharing behavior, maybe you go to a playground and observe their sharing. Obviously, you should get permission to go to this playground to do that. But essentially, naturalistic observation is that. It's when you are trying to observe things in the real world, in their natural setting. If you wanted to look at how college students interact with each other, maybe you go to a coffee shop or something like that near campus. A laboratory setting is another good way to do observations. The problem with laboratory settings is you might change people's behavior subtly or even dramatically. People in a laboratory setting will know that they are being observed. They're probably there with informed consent to do the study, so they probably know they're part of a study. So with that being said, you can elicit specific types of behaviors more easily, put them in specific scenarios. So it's a good way to observe if you want to pull out something specific. Another way that we do research is surveys. A lot of my research in my dissertation was on how to make good survey tools. Surveys are a way we can ask people about their beliefs, their ideas, what's important to them, what the behaviors they are, or what the behaviors they're doing are, how they understand things. So you can get a lot of good data from surveys. There's also ways to make sure that you're getting really good, accurate data through systematically making a survey better. One thing that we have are things like lie scales. A really funny example of a lie scale is when you're asking adolescents about their drug use habits. One thing that we often do is put in fake drugs to the list of drugs. So if you're asking people, how often do you use these drugs? You might have someone saying, I use all the drugs all the time. But if you also include, let's say, 3 drugs that don't actually exist, and they are also saying that they use those all the time, you can be pretty sure that that participant is lying. So there's a lot of ways to make surveys better. There are limitations of surveys. Obviously, people can lie. You can't observe directly their behavior. They might be reporting behavior that is deflated or inflated over reality. But there's ways that we can make them better and use them as a good tool. It's also really easy to do statistical analysis with survey results. So there's a lot of good reasons to use them. Another good tool is interviews. Interviews take a lot longer than surveys generally, where you're asking someone things one-on-one. You can do group interviews as well, but it does take a long time. And with that, though, you can get a lot of really in-depth data that can be really informative and really useful. A standardized test is similar to a survey in specific ways. Oftentimes you're answering questions or solving problems. The Stanford-Binet IQ test, a lot of IQ tests are standardized where you can compare scores to other people. Where if you are comparing the score on a general survey from years ago to people now, if it wasn't standardized or did specific methods with it, you can't actually compare their scores to one another. Versus standardized tests, you can. A case study is a really in-depth observation of some unusual case, something different or unusual. It can be really small, like one individual, or it can be a bigger group overall. So one example is maybe this young child here is very, very intelligent. They can solve problems really well. Maybe they can already play the piano like a master. And so you're wondering, well, why? What are some other interesting things about this unique person who is masterful at playing the piano? So you have them solve problems, you study them individually for this special, unique case and examining that. Another example here is these kids in Thailand, they actually made a club just in their playing, like without any kind of parental interaction, without being told to do this. They basically just started a club for fun with kids in their neighborhood. And over time, it became more and more structured into what we would basically consider a nonprofit. You can see this building here that they're in. They built that. They just used the supplies that were available just to build this building. They use it to hold meetings, make plans of things like games that they'll play, tournaments that they'll set up, but also like community actions. So, like direct actions in the community, like let's clean up trash. And again, there's no parent involvement here. This is just what these kids and adolescents decided to do. So, it's a really interesting case that we can look at in a case study of what are the capacities of children and adolescents. And it seems like they're capable of a lot more than a lot of people give them credit for. So, a really unique kind of situation that occurred, that they essentially have what amounts to bylaws, like ways that they work together, just like a nonprofit would, which is very interesting. Oftentimes, we use physiological measures as well. And with that, we often use it in combination with other things. Like you could do surveys and interviews, you could do surveys and physiological measures. Physiological measures are kind of anything physical. So your fMRI, looking at other brain scans, heart rate, hormone levels. So I had some peers that were doing a study where they sent people short surveys, just like to their phone. Essentially, they would get a notification, they would answer like two questions, maybe three questions, take less than 2 minutes to do that, and then they would get that either like once to three times a day. And so they were doing this for a couple weeks, but twice a week they would also do a cheek swab. And it gave them some hormone levels that they were looking for. That basically the participant would do this cheek swab, same time of day, and twice a week, put it in the mail, send it off to a lab. And that together gave them a lot of really great data on stress levels and happiness, things like that. And these measures are being used a lot more recently. You can pause the video and kind of consider why that might be. So hopefully you did pause and try to think of some ideas. But some of the main reasons that physiological measures are being used more now is because a lot of them are getting more accessible. It's getting easier and cheaper to get a lab to test blood samples or skin samples, to test heart rate, to get access to MRIs. So it's still not accessible as maybe we'd like. Fitness trackers and things can be useful, but maybe aren't always the best data. You might have seen that if you have something like a Fitbit. Sometimes it's just not getting it perfectly. But it is a really useful tool, especially in conjunction with other things. A lot of these tools have a lot of research behind them, so they can be very valid and useful. Other ways that we do research is descriptive research. We might just want to describe what we see. So surveys, interviews, case studies, we might just be describing this is what we're seeing. We can do correlations. We can compare variables to one another. Basically, a correlation is taking two variables and putting math to it. So we might look at sharing behaviors and if the kid ate all their lunch, like the percentage of lunch that the kid ate. Maybe there is a relationship there. We can look for a correlation. So correlations go from -1, which is the strongest possible correlation in a negative direction, to 0, which is the weakest correlation possible, no relationship at all, to +1. So +1 is the strongest possible correlation on the positive end. And this is a graph of a very strong positive correlation. Positive just means the arrow goes up. Negative just means the arrow goes down. So it's just math terms. This is a negative correlation. This is a positive correlation, but -1 and +1 are equally strong correlations. The positive and negative are just math. It's not a value of it being a good thing or a bad thing. So an interesting example is that we do find a strong positive correlation between ice cream sales and violent crime. So what does that mean? What does it mean that ice cream sales are correlated or related to violent crime? So kind of nothing. Correlation does not mean causation. Ice cream sales are not causing violent crime. Violent crime is not causing more ice cream to be sold. There's actually a third variable here of heat. When it's hotter outside, we tend to see more violent crime. When it's hotter outside, we tend to see more people buying ice cream. And so while we can actually measure a correlation, a relationship there, it doesn't mean that one causes the other. They are related to one another. We can see a mathematical relationship, but it doesn't mean that one causes the other. Sometimes there's a third causing both two things in a correlation. Sometimes a correlation points to an actual causal relationship, but correlation just tells us we can see a relationship between these variables. So here are some actual graphs from some of my data, and this actually came from my dissertation. So I was working on this heroism scale. So it was 8 questions total, and this was 4 of its questions. So heroism is all of the questions, social heroism is 4 of the questions. So these were very correlated because these 4 questions were half of these questions. So you can see the graph here, very strong positive correlation. The number is 0.89. So very, very strong positive correlation because it's half the questions. Of course, it should be correlated. The questions in a survey should be pretty related to one another. But let's look at this heroism combined with something else. Let's look at it with purpose in life. So the graph over here, we can use this table, go long, and purpose is right here. So this is the graph. You can see it's pretty all over the place, but the calculator essentially can determine there is a positive correlation here. This is the number, 0.33. So there is a relatively weak, moderately strong, or I forget exactly the wording I use. It's not a super strong relationship, but it's there. There's a relationship between heroism and purpose in life. Some people with purpose in life also felt or also were willing to take heroic action. People who don't have purpose in life are less likely to take heroic action. But you can see there's some people that don't fall in there. This person's pretty high in purpose, pretty low in heroism. So heroism scores are going to be the up-down ones. Purpose scores are going to be the left-right ones here. So there is a relationship though, and the calculator can find that. So there are some examples of actual real correlations. One that was really good is social desirability. Didn't want the questions about will you do something heroic to give socially desirable answers for people to just want to make themselves look good. So I wanted a very low correlation. If you remember, 0 is the lowest correlation. 0.06 is the correlation between social desirability and heroism. So basically 0. There was no relationship between people answering socially desirably and their answers on heroism. So that was good. All right, another type of research that we do is experiments. Experiments can determine cause. We talked about correlations. Correlations just show us relationships. Experiments show us causes. In an experiment, you have to have at least 2 variables, like maybe sharing and food. There's 2 variables there. And then you have to manipulate at least one of them. You can't have more than 2, but you always have to manipulate at least one. You can have 3 variables, manipulate 2 of those 3, and all sorts of things. But let's keep it simple with a little example. We can have 2 variables here. We can have a variable of loudness of room and a test score. So we could put people in a quiet room, and then we could put another half of the class in a loud room, have them all take a test, let's say it's a math test, and see who does better. So these variables have names. An independent variable, or an IV, is the variable that the researcher changes or manipulates. So in this case, what did we change? What's different between these two groups? Well, the loudness of the room, right? So we've got a quiet room, we've got a loud room. The loudness of the room is the independent variable, the one that we as the researcher manipulated. The dependent variable is the one that's the final measured variable. It's the one we want to see if it changes based on the manipulation. So what are we looking at? What do we want to see if it changes? The test score. So the test score is called the dependent variable, or the DV. So we have an independent variable that we manipulate, the loudness of the room. We've got a dependent variable that we measure, the test score. And we want to see, is this group's test score on average higher than this group's test score? So you could do this in another way too. You could have a room that's totally quiet, and you could have a room with soft music playing, maybe some classical music. Maybe you'd have a hypothesis of which group would do better on a test. And you can actually do that experiment and see, well, does this quiet music cause them to do better on a test? So with that, there is another thing to be aware of in experiments. You want to make sure your groups are about as equal as possible. So there can be a variety of things that might affect math test score, right? What if you just accidentally got everyone who's really good at math in the experimental group? So even though they're in the loud room, they might just be the ones that are better at math. And this is all the people who are not as good at math. Obviously, their score is probably going to be a little higher than the ones that are worse at math. So you want to split that up. You want to split the good math students and the bad math students between the groups. So let's say the orange are the good math students, the purple are the bad math students. They don't know their math quite as well. So you want to evenly or randomly assign them to those two groups to make it less likely that your result comes from that other factor. So we can do this with anything. Randomization helps for a lot of things because you might not know what could affect your experiment. Maybe it's how well they know math, but maybe it's how much they slept that day. If they remembered to take medicine that day, if they needed it. Maybe it's more dependent on the time of day. Maybe some people do better in the morning than at night on tests, right? So there could be a ton of other variables. So to reduce all of those possible confounds is what it's called, a confounding variable, you randomly assign them to two groups. So you've got the orange people and the purple people equally distributed. The orange and purple can be any of those variables. Maybe orange is they do better at tests in the morning. Purple is they do better at tests at night. Maybe orange is male, purple is female. Maybe it's orange is one ethnicity and purple is another ethnicity. Now, some of those would probably not have any impact on math, right? But depending on your experiment, it possibly would, right? Maybe a specific culture in a specific experiment you're doing might have more experience with what you're testing. So they might do better or worse based on the culture that they're in. So you want them randomly assigned to either group. So randomization really helps to reduce any other possible likelihood to make it more clear that it's your treatment, that it's your independent variable, that it's your manipulation that made the actual change. All right, another thing that we do is cross-sectional design. So this is the first example of a really developmental focused design. Again, development is change over time. Cross-sectional designs look and focus on change over time. So cross-sectional design is when you take people of different ages and you measure them at the same day or the same point in time. It might not actually be day, but just to make it simple, let's say I would go into schools today and I would get 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds. I would measure them all on, say, how well they could remember a random string of numbers. I count how many they could remember after 2 minutes of memorizing and then see who's got the best memory. So I can compare the 5-year-olds to the 10-year-olds to the 15-year-olds. Maybe I would see that the 15-year-olds remember more, 10-year-olds a little less, and the 5-year-olds the least. From that, I could make some conclusions. I could say, well, it might be that the 15-year-olds have better memories. So that is one way that we do developmental research is through a cross-sectional design. It's easy because we can get all the people at one time, even if it's not in one day, it's probably within like a week or a month of each other that you're measuring them in the same way. So, with that being said, though, there might be differences, right? Maybe the 15-year-olds were taught in a different way than the 10-year-olds or the 5-year-olds. Maybe the way that they were taught in history was better. Maybe they got a better teaching method than the younger participants. So it might look like the older people are better at have better memories, but maybe they just have a better trained skill and it's not actually the age or the development. There could be history effects. Because of that, the best developmental method that we have is called the longitudinal study. And the key word here is long, because it takes a long time to do them. Essentially, what you do here is you take one group and follow them over a long time. So we'd take those 5-year-olds, we'd measure their memory today. We'd come back in 5 years, we'd measure their memory when they're 10, come back in 5 years and measure their memory at 15. And we would try to see what does the memory do over time. And since we're using the same group of people, they're having the same kind of history effects. So they're not going to have the weaknesses of the cross-sectional design. The weaknesses of this design is you have to wait that whole 10 years from the time they're 5 to 15 to get the rest of your data. And so that's a struggle. So another thing that you can do is put them together with a sequential method. In the sequential method, you would take 5 and 10-year-olds today, and then in 5 years, you measure the 5-year-olds who are now 10, the 10-year-olds are now 15, so you have a group that's 5, 10, and 15 compare. So you've got cross-sectional plus longitudinal together. So the really great thing about longitudinal is it gives us really fantastic data on development over time. We did some cross-sectional studies of cognitive capacities of adults. And from those studies, it seemed to us that after like the 40s and 50s, cognitive capacities were declining. And that's what people assumed for a long time because that's what the data we had said. But we got that data from cross-sectional studies comparing today you would compare 80-year-olds, 70-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 40-year-olds, so on and so forth, all the way down the line through adulthood in a cross-sectional design. But then some researchers had enough funding over time that they could do the same thing with a longitudinal sample. So this had hundreds of participants. They measured inductive reasoning, spatial orientation, perceptual speed, numeric ability, verbal memory, a bunch of cognitive capacities, and they followed them from the time that they were 25 to basically when they passed away. So on this graph, we've got 88, but they did continue to follow them. And what you should see here is a general trend line where it's very, very flat, and then it really starts dropping off after about 75. And that's what we found with this study and other replications of it, is that even though you can see a drop here from about, say, 50 to a little above 45, you can see the scale is kind of cut. So this drop from 50 to 45, we can measure that, but an outside person and the person themselves wouldn't really notice that decline. So if you're their partner, if you're their friend, if you're their child, you're not going to notice this decline because it's not actually a very dramatic decline. So in reality, we don't see significant declines in cognitive capacity until people are pushing through the mid 70s. So that is a really inspiring thing, I think, as well. Another cool thing we found from these types of studies are that people who start to do cognitive training activities, whether it's learning new skills, whether it's actual cognitive training games, reading new types of books, engaging their mind, their line doesn't decline. It stays level or it even goes up. So old humans can learn new tricks. So we can keep our cognitive capacities increasing until we die, which I think is fantastic because that's one thing, aside from having like a neurodegenerative illness. If you're using your brain, the plasticity will allow it to keep gaining capacities unless you do have something like a neurodegenerative illness. That is another possibility, a big risk factor there. But yeah, this is longitudinal designs. It's kind of the gold standard in developmental research because it shows us very clearly how people change over time. All right, with that, this is a good video to watch to get a lot of detail on conducting ethical research. Your book goes over quite a few things that we'll skip, but I do want to make a couple emphases. One is that since the Belmont report really came out and showed that both medicine and psychology were failing participants in a lot of ways and being really terrible to a lot of participants, we've created review boards to try and help keep participants safe. So institutional review boards are an organization that anytime I want to do a study, I have to send it to an IRB, to an institutional review board, and say, hey, this is how I plan to treat participants. These are the questions I'm going to ask them. This is the process that they're going to go through the study with. This is what I'm going to do with their data and their personal information. Does this look good? Or do I need to make changes? Usually they come back with saying, can you clarify this? Maybe you need to make a change. For example, one time I had forgot to write it in there. I was planning to keep the data on password protected hard drives that were encrypted, but I hadn't written it in there. So I had to resubmit again. And then they said, okay, yep, it looks like you're treating participant data well, you're treating participants well, you can do the study. So there are other organizations in other countries like the IRB. Some of them are even more strict than the ones here in the US. So if you're interested in any of those, there's a link in the slides down here that you can click on. So some of the main things that we're concerned with that we want to keep to protect participants is one, informed consent. We want participants to be informed of potential risks. We might not be able to tell them absolutely everything about the study, right? I've done this before in an experiment. I've said, hey, you're going to be doing an experiment. There will be a control group. There will be a treatment group. Both groups are going to get interactive activities that they do online. It will last over the course of a week, about 15 to 20 minutes a day. And at the end of it, you'll do a survey. Tell them some of the risks, anything it's not really any more risky than they would get in general daily social situations. So I told them flat out the possible risks, but I didn't tell them which group they would be in. So I informed them of all possible things that would make them go, okay, yeah, I don't want to take that much time, or I am willing to take that much time. I don't really want to do computer activities. So I gave them the information to make an informed decision. That's informed consent. So confidentiality is another important one. You want to keep the participants' data confidential. So you don't publish their data in a way that people can figure out who it is, especially with minor data. If I have reported that I worked with 3 schools in the Southern California area, which I did, it might be possible to figure out who a person is if I name one of the actual schools. Right? If I say this was a person who was this ethnicity in this grade, even if I don't use their name, but you can narrow down what school it is, you might be like, well, that's one of like 3 people in that school. So it's probably one of those people. You want to make sure it's not identifiable in any way. No usernames are published, no emails, no people's names, no phone numbers, things like that. Also, the data that you collect, you want to make sure it's password protected, encrypted, even locked in a locked file cabinet or something like that. Another thing is debriefing. So make sure after the study, participants leave with no bad feelings. They don't feel like they did after the Milgram study that they might have just hurt someone, right? You want to make sure it's even best if they take away some skill. So if you've taught them something new about themselves, if they've gained a new ability, that's a really great way to handle debriefings. But at the minimum, they need the contact information of the researcher. You got to make sure that they're okay afterwards. And the last one is deception. Basically, we don't use deception unless it's absolutely necessary. So for example, my earlier example of telling them you're doing an experiment, there's a control and treatment group. I'm not leaving anything out, but I'm not telling them exactly which group they're going to be in. So that's about as much deception as you would ever want to use. There might be cases where you might have to use a little bit more. Those are going to be more heavily reviewed by the IRB to make sure that you are doing as much as possible to give the most informed consent that you can to these participants. And the main idea with all of these research methods is to answer questions and solve problems. I'm an applied psychologist, so I do applied work, try and work and solve problems. So my hope is that when we find socially significant problems and when we have socially significant problems, maybe it's poverty or homelessness, we can do research to solve the problem. We can see what's been done in the real world, what are current community practitioners doing. We can look at theory around the systems that affect homelessness or poverty. We can use research methods to test out new things. Once we test things out and find things that work or don't work, we can send that information to audiences, whether it's policymakers, whether it's other researchers, whether it's evaluators. And then we kind of go in this cycle of continuing to work on this problem over time, and hopefully we solve those problems. So that is the cycle of applied research that I think we can take with psychology. It's really useful in a lot of different arenas. So that is also the end of chapter 1 in lifespan development. So next week we will be into chapter 2.